Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so can we all just admit that like Donny Cates is absolutely killing it on the Venom series? Like this is crazy. Like here's the funny thing. Venom has not been this interesting since like Agent Venom. Venom has not been this interesting to me in a long time. This is one of the coolest things. Okay, where Oversight kind of introduced like the Maker into the whole thing with Venom, and then like Eddie Brock sort of went forward as like Agent Venom to a degree. This kind of focuses on the backside of the story, right? And it really kind of focuses a lot on Eddie and like his perception of himself, right, in terms of like the role he plays and so on and so forth, but also kind of introduces a pretty important character. What it does initially is it kind of opens up with like Eddie's introspection of like his own life, and basically saying that like he's a screw up. All he's ever done is like screw up and bring like pain and anguish to other people. And with a previous story where Oversight kind of, basically had him show up to his dad's house and really kind of brought in the idea that Eddie's dad was sort of a dick, or there was at least a problem with the two of them, it really kind of focuses more on that when he goes back to visit his dad again, and the two of them hate each other. Something that I also want you guys to kind of notice here is that Donny Cates kind of plants the early seeds of a kind of victim mentality here when it comes to the father of Eddie, in the sense that like his father immediately starts screaming at him and Eddie kind of cowers away. And that's not something that you normally see, right? Like when you think of Eddie Brock as Venom, you think of him as kind of like this imposing force, right? Like nothing scares Eddie Brock. But one of the things that Cates has been focusing on a lot when it came to his Venom run is like the character of Eddie. And it's like the one thing nobody ever really seemed to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many people love the story of Venom so far, because the symbiote itself is as much of a story as Eddie Brock is. And then with the two of them kind of working together, you of course get the cohesive unit of the symbiote. But when the father of Eddie basically lashes out and goes to attack him, the Venom symbiote responds accordingly. Now remember, as it was kind of speculated by the Maker, the Venom symbiote is almost in kind of like a catatonic state, or almost kind of like a brain dead state, in the sense that like its personality and all that kind of stuff is gone, but it reacts in like a defensive way. Now of course this brings in Dylan. Now Dylan's been here for a little bit, right? Like he showed up in issue number 7, but it's basically been like the younger brother of Eddie is how it's been shown so far. And so it's kind of a cool little thing, because when that happens, the Venom symbiote kind of subsides, rebonds itself to Eddie, and then leaves. Now, this is a very important thing, because what this shows is that in a lot of ways, the Venom symbiote still functions according to what it is that Eddie wants. But where you end up having Eddie basically making his escape, with the Venom symbiote and kind of, taking off, and then a couple days later, Dylan basically picks up with Eddie having been beaten by Eddie's father. And so again, a pretty personal stake that's being invested in here in terms of like how this is unfolding, because the response of Dylan is, we have to kill our father. But with regards to the conversation that goes on between the two of them, it's kind of these fun little discussions that go on. Of course, Eddie Brock is really just kind of like, I'd rather be fighting that dragon god thing than like talking to this little kid. But it's kind of a cool scenario, because this kid kind of starts asking questions like, aren't you a good guy now? Like, where do you stand on things? Kind of asking these moral compass questions. And the funny thing about that is that in a lot of ways, it's kind of the audience asking the question to Eddie Brock, right? Like, where are you at morally right now? Are you a good guy? Are you a bad guy? Are you still somewhere in between? Where do you stand? And the cool thing about the way that Donny Cates writes this is that Eddie Brock's kind of like, I don't really know. I mean, I'm trying to do good things, but like, I'm a really crappy person. And that's where things really begin to get a little hairy, because when we talk about this whole idea, when Donny Cates introduced this idea that Eddie Brock's father essentially went bankrupt as a result of like the hospital bills and all those things that Eddie Brock went through after getting into a car wreck, our assumption was that the little kid running out in front of the car was Eddie Brock. And basically he was injured and his dad blamed him because of all the amounting medical bills and everything. And it just made his father broke. The reality is a lot darker. That what had basically happened was Eddie Brock had gotten drunk with a bunch of his friends and then went joyriding and killed a kid in the process. And so because of Eddie Brock's negligence, because of his ineptitude, what this basically meant was that his father literally came along and said, well, the police were interrogating him, we were like, look, you're a rich man, you're very influential, we can probably find a way to make this go away, but your kid has to plead not guilty. Where Eddie Brock wanted to basically sacrifice. He wanted to be like, I'm guilty of this. I've committed this crime. I killed this kid. I should be punished for it. His father wouldn't let him. And this is really, really important here, because this is kind of Donny Cates building on the character of Eddie. You notice the Venom symbiote really isn't a huge part of this little segment. It's focusing exclusively on Eddie. And what this really hits at here is that Eddie was a good guy who made a terrible decision. And where he was willing to go through and deal with the consequences of it, he was convinced not to. When his father beat him, when his father forced him to basically admit that he was innocent, it was literally like, hey, his father paid off the judges, his father paid off lawyers, and that's what made his dad broke. But basically he blames Eddie Brock for it. But it's kind of a crazy thing, because the father of Eddie blames Eddie for something that his father created, right? Like, he could have just let his son go to jail. But under the surface of all this, under the waters here is like a father who wanted to keep his son out of jail. He would go to any length to make sure that his son was not in prison. But it really kind of begs the question, who's actually the good guy here? The father who wouldn't let his son go to jail, the father who would do anything to make sure his son wouldn't have this black mark on the rest of his life, that he wouldn't go to jail forever, or the young kid who committed that act and was willing to deal with the consequences of it. Who's really the good guy here? There is no such thing as like absolute right and absolute wrong. It's all based on how things unfold and the compass there. And that's kind of the message that Eddie gives to Dylan, right? Like, I'm not a good guy. I've done terrible things. I killed a kid and then I lied about the fact that I was guilty just so I could get off because my father convinced me to. But the other part of this, and really the way this kind of folds into the nature of Eddie, and as far as this Venom symbiote is concerned, is that Eddie's still kind of feeling the after effects of this, right? Like, there's this kind of hallucination that goes on. As Eddie begins to converse and begins to get closer to Dylan, the symbiote kind of kicks in and then like basically tricks him into believing that he's seeing like the symbiote god, right? Now, we don't really know the motivation behind this, but Eddie begins to lash out. And when he does so, he witnesses Dylan and believes Dylan's the symbiote god and then starts attacking Dylan, only for Dylan to basically kind of reason with him and say, hey, look, you're hurting me. You have to stop. And then Eddie kind of really coming to and returning to his normal self. But it's a cool little thing here because Eddie starts coughing, basically starts bleeding everywhere, so on and so forth. And he's taken to a hospital by Dylan, only for us to find out that what's basically going on here is that with the Maker overseeing his treatment, presumably by doing some pretty shady stuff to make it happen, that Eddie Brock's cancer has basically returned. Now, the cancer of Eddie Brock is kind of an interesting thing because it's almost kind of like what Donny Cates was trying to do before it was done by Donny Cates. The idea was to kind of write Eddie out as a character who wasn't using the Venom symbiote because he had cancer, because he was kind of like essentially dying. Now, when Dan Slott did that, he kind of rolled it into the story of like Mr. Negative, like the idea that like Mr. Negative was on one hand, he was the good guy, like treating all these people who were ill, and then on the other hand, like a villain, but it was a cool little circumstance in terms of how it took place. But the recovery of Eddie Brock was kind of like a little mini story arc unto itself, where he was trying to basically atone for his past misdeeds and different things like that. Now, again, his cancer was basically cured by Mr. Negative. That was really the end of that. And then in turn, like it allowed him to kind of go forward as trying to be a good guy. But what happens is that while he's recovering in this hospital, he starts to have these illusions of this girl, Anne. Now, Anne is the sister that Eddie Brock had, or at least as it's explained by Donny Cates, the sister he had that died of cancer. And then like he goes into this room where he basically has his Uncle Dan who's dying of cancer, that all these different people are essentially dying of cancer in his life. And it's kind of sort of forcing him to go through and like relive these circumstances over and over and over again. Now, we don't really know what the end result of this intention is, of like why he's seeing these things. At least it's not explained right off the bat. Instead, again, it kind of jumps to the Maker talking to Dylan, basically saying, look, I'm trying to find a way to pull the Venom symbiote off of Eddie Brock and so on and so forth, and try to find a way to cure him and, different things along those lines. But then suddenly in Eddie's dream state, he ends up at the bell tower. Now, the bell tower that Eddie Brock was at, again, is kind of a hallmark of his character, at least in the church anyway, at the bottom of the bell tower. But the idea behind here was that, like, according to how it's written here, he was going there to die. Like, right? Like, Peter Parker cost him like his job. He cost him all that kind of stuff when he exposed Eddie Brock as basically like a fraud. And then in turn, Eddie was going to kill himself. But that's at the exact same time during Web of Spider-Man when Peter Parker basically cast the Venom symbiote off of himself. And then in turn, the Venom symbiote basically took, bonded itself to Eddie. But it's kind of interesting because for those who remember the old stories of Venom, you're probably looking at this and saying like, but that's not how this played out though. And that's exactly what Eddie begins to realize, is that these are all illusions. These things are not the way that they were. And when he begins to ask the Venom symbiote why this is happening and what's going on here, suddenly like the beans begin to get spilled. That what we basically end up learning here is that every instance where Eddie Brock basically had cancer, he never actually had cancer. Instead, the Venom symbiote was afraid that he would leave. And so Eddie, having some kind of sickness, would look at the Venom symbiote and say, it heals me, I'm going to go back to it. Essentially, the Venom symbiote never wanted to be alone. It's all a ruse to keep Eddie coming back. And that's what Eddie realizes, that essentially the Venom symbiote's been tricking him all this time. All these years, it's been manipulating him in order to make sure that Eddie stays with it. And what this does is it takes decades of Venom history and turns it on its head. But it's a cool little thing because when Eddie begins to realize this, the Venom symbiote says, like, the reason why we've done what we've done is because we knew if you realized the truth of who Dylan was, you would leave us. And that's when it dawns on Eddie Brock that Dylan is not his brother, that Dylan is his son. Now, what this does is it jumps back to the Amazing Spider-Man 375 and Amazing Spider-Man number 19, I think it was, and basically goes with like a woman by the name of Anne. I can't remember what her last name is, but basically Anne was like she-Venom, right? Like the idea was that back during, in the early 1990s, back in 1993, that Marvel wanted to kind of introduce like more symbiotes, right? Because like Venom was hugely popular when he first popped up. Anne was a chick who was basically like the wife of Eddie at the time. She had gotten into a conflict. She'd basically sustained injuries that would have killed her. And then Eddie kind of split off a portion of his symbiote, which bonded to her, healed her. And then she went forward as she-Venom for a time. And then in turn, turn, like he ended up, she ended up casting the symbiote off and he got it back. But during that time when the symbiote left her, she ended up pregnant. And so for the most part, like we didn't really know what happened during that era. Instead, she ended up like dying, I think in issue number 19 of I want to say it was Amazing Spider-Man number 19, volume 2, number 19, but I'm not going to swear to that. But basically, like, she was written out of the story. And so what this does is kind of come in and like bookend the whole thing and basically say that like Anne went running to the father of Eddie Brock and then basically said like, you're the only real family that's there. You have to raise this kid. I'll come back when I'm of sound mind. And of course, like she never did. She threw herself off a building and died. It's a cool little thing here because what this means is that with Eddie going forward and realizing what's happening, the Venom symbiote literally responds when you have like the father of Eddie riding with Dylan and then in turn, like essentially going to like attack him, because he was mouthing off. And the Venom symbiote's kind of like, hey, look, what we're going to do is we're going to put you to sleep and then you're going to wake up somewhere else. And that's what ends up happening. When the father of Eddie wakes up, he's basically in the same cell where he forced Eddie to admit that he was innocent, forced Eddie to say like, you're innocent, you're not going to go to jail for your crimes, that kind of good stuff. And so what happens is like Eddie starts addressing his father. Now, this is very important because up to this point, Eddie had basically always chalked up like the failures of his life to the abusive nature of his father. And it was one of those things where Kate's kind of hit at the idea that like Eddie never truly took responsibility for the things that he did. It was always somebody else's fault. The victim mentality only ever goes so far. And that's kind of what Eddie hits on here. Eddie basically starts lashing out at his dad and then basically says, look, I'm a screw up. Yes, I get that like you did a lot of terrible things to me, but I'm finally at a point where like I realize that like a lot of the mistakes that I made, I did because like I was a functioning adult and I refused to accept my own past. I refused to accept the responsibility of the decisions that I make. Then I just chalked everything up to you. But I'm trying to be a good guy. I'm trying to do the right thing. So here's what's going to happen, Pops. Like if at any point you come along, if at any point, you basically appear in my life or the life of this child, the life of Dylan, I will kill you. It's kind of giving him a warning, basically saying like, don't ever come back here again. And so his response is, you're going to wake up and you're going to be alone for the rest of your life, which is truly the one thing that Eddie Brock's father really fears. But in that moment, what ends up happening is a symbiote basically picks up Dylan, they begin to walk away, and the symbiote says like, both of you guys are better off without me, basically telling us that like the symbiote has left Eddie Brock, that the symbiote is going forward as his own entity, doing its own thing outside of Eddie or anybody else, which is something that we haven't really seen before. We've seen that insofar as the symbiote like seeks out a host, and it might do some things in between the time when it's finding hosts, but for the most part, like it seems to be out doing its own thing now, absent anybody else. So it's kind of cool. It basically leaves it on like a pretty huge cliffhanger, like where the heck did it go? How is all this coming together now? So again, really Donny Cates kind of splitting the difference between the two, focusing one part on the symbiote and then focusing one part on Eddie Brock and building both characters respectively, which I think is pretty awesome because what it would mean is that when Eddie rebonds to the Venom symbiote, which he most likely will do, it basically gives us a chance to kind of see them bond in a new light and see to kind of like where they're going to go from there. So I'm pretty excited about it. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.